Daniel Barber. He's the chair of architectural history and theory at the TUI Eindhoven. He focuses on how architects engage with climate over the last century and how historical knowledge of architecture, climate, and energy can impact the ways that we design, build, and live in houses today. His most recent books include Modern Architecture and Climate, Design Before Air Conditioning, and A House in the Sun, Modern Architecture and Solar Energy in the Cold War. And he's been also the co-editor of a series of After Comfort. This is a series of articles in the Flux Architecture platform that I highly recommend. And he was also recently involved in the one installation in the Arsenale in the Venice Biennale that he will talk about. That for me was one of the most impressive installations there. You will see why. He was been focusing a lot in this impact of air conditioning and the inequalities that it brings, and also how architecture has been driven by these moments that we've been living of surplus of energy or expending energy at whatever cost. So please welcome Daniel Barber.
Great to be here. I think a really interesting moment in our discussions in architecture. Kind of tired of solutions, right? Tired of sustainability, increasingly aware of how so many of our solutions are themselves carbon intensive, right? And trying to find other pathways. I'm hoping my iPad doesn't fall down. And I really wanted to have the simultaneous translation as I was talking, but I thought it might be too distracting. But if there's any terms or concepts that don't quite make it through, feel free to let me know. So thank you so much for having us here again. As I was saying, I think it's a really important discussion to be having, again, as we're facing some collective frustration around the solutions that we've been navigating the past couple decades. And I appreciate, if I understood correctly in the introduction, the kind of frustration with decoupling, the kind of impossibility of decoupling, and this kind of question around sustainability, right? I mean, what happens after sustainability, I think, is our question today as architects. A push, I would say, against solutions and towards practices. So that's a theme that I'll play out a little bit. I've been preoccupied the past couple decades, as implied in some of the comments in the introduction, with thermally conditioned interiors, right? Spaces not quite like this. We could open this window if we wanted to, right? But spaces where, in order to survive inside, you need the kind of ventilation systems, heating systems, cooling systems that sort of allow that air to move, right? So I can't see them, but I'm focused a bit on these kind of ventilation jets that I think are facing the top of the stage here, as a way of really thinking about, right, how we're sort of arranging ourselves according to the imperatives of this thermal interior, right? So thinking about this concept of the thermal interior as this kind of space of life. Oops. Second, sorry, bear with me. So preoccupied with these thermally conditioned spaces, not only with the conditioning that has been done sort of to us, right, as individuals, and of course I'm speaking in a place where the climate is seasonally pleasant enough that you're not as reliant upon air conditioning or even heating as some other regions of the world, right? But I'm sure we can probably all imagine a room that you've been in recently, maybe a hotel room or a doctor's office or something of that nature, where you needed that ventilation system to survive, right? Where we were dependent upon the fossil-fueled mechanical system just to kind of live and breathe in that space. Yeah? So I want to actually ask you to sort of imagine that space for a moment, the most recent sealed environment that you've been in. I used to show pictures of like the Seagram's Tower as one of the kind of ultimate examples of a sealed conditioned space, or even the Lever House. But they're too appealing, right? You can't find ugly pictures of the Seagram's Tower necessarily, so it makes it look like I'm promoting these sorts of practices, which I'm not. So I'm asking instead for you to sort of imagine for yourself how these spaces have operated in your life, right? Imagine yourself, again, in a space that's sort of requiring that air conditioning, right? And even to kind of look around the room a bit and see, I already pointed out the jets above, there's a little ventilation fan over there. Again, we have the windows available for us. I don't know if any of you get claustrophobic in some of those spaces, but I always like to kind of know there's a window that can open. I'm not quite sure what that does. I'm showing a few videos here, and sorry for some of the technical complications, that are time-lapse images, 24 hours in a space that was recently renovated, and then was, as you can see, in particular by the third window panel there that's gotten a little clouded, right, where there were some complications with the window seal, right? And I'm not going to get into this too much today, but just sort of start with this, on the one hand, to consider the sort of challenges of reuse and retrofits and the kind of against demolition world that has become a large part of our discussions, to recognize the complexities there. But even more so to kind of think about how we're working with our buildings, right? We live in relationship to our buildings. And so there's a kind of aspect here of kind of thinking about what happens, what does this room do in the nighttime, right? How does it sort of operate? How does it recover from the day's use? The air conditioning and heating and the people walking in and out, the cleaning that happens. How do we see ourselves living in concert, right? Living in a sort of collaboration with our buildings as we imagine our future and imagine a future inside, right? A future within this thermal space. So as a first point of entry, I want to talk about these thermally isolated spaces. You all have one in your head, right? Is this working? You can have it in your mind, a space that you need the air conditioning to survive. To think of these spaces as spaces of the neoliberal imaginary and reality. And I'm using neoliberal, I'll use it a couple of times in a very general sense, right? In this first case, in the kind of Margaret Thatcher sense, right? Based out of Hayek. This kind of premise that society doesn't exist, right? That there's a kind of imperative for individual activity to take care of itself, to prioritize one's own needs. So to think about these kind of spaces of thermal consistency as spaces that take care of themselves, right? That prioritize their own optimization, be that for work or again for a hotel stay or for, the airport's efficiency. Have no conception of society, have no conception of the impacts that those thermal spaces might be having on the rest of the world. So, in some ways this is about privatization in this kind of simple version, but it's also about this kind of question of self-interest, right? And ascribing some of that self-interest to these spaces themselves and the way that we occupy them. So if these spaces exist as if there is no society, they're conceived, again, thermally, mechanically, carbonistically, if that's a word I can make up, like they only need to take care of themselves, right? And really rely on those mechanical systems to do so, right? And it's important to note, too, that when I'm talking about these thermal spaces, again, imagine the space in your head, right? You're conditioned in a certain way. You're entering that space in a sort of agreement to be comfortable in this thermally organized space. But so are all the materials and systems within the building itself, right? If this space was left without any sort of thermal adjustments, potentially the wood on this stage would eventually develop some mold. Maybe there'd be some sort of buckles in the floor, right? Our materials, generally speaking, and I'm extrapolating a bit because I think this building is a bit more smartly designed than I'm accrediting it. Our materials themselves are dependent upon this thermal consistency, right? And so without them, we would be overwhelmed by mold in some of these other spaces. Okay. Give me a few times, I might sort of jump through some things to get to some slides. In the midst of some projects that he was involved in 1947, the architect Richard Neutra said the following: "There has, of course, always been comfort in the world, reckless comfort, I would say, comfort based on someone else's continuous labor." And so that's the kind of framework that I want to approach, again, this kind of question of these neoliberal thermally optimized spaces, right? As spaces that are dependent upon multiple forms of exploitation. And we can think of that, of course, in the site of energy extraction and distribution, the costs we all know of carbon emissions and the unequally distributed costs of those developments. We can think as well of the kind of immediate costs, right? The direct costs. If we had an air conditioner sitting in this window, we could imagine that. Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't need it today necessarily, but it would be making this space cold, right? While heating the outside, right? There's a direct kind of waste heat aspect in which it's quite literally heating the outside as we cool ourselves. Neutra was one of many, sorry, having a few issues here. There we go. Neutra was one of many architects in the 1940s and the immediate post-war period, post-World War II period, to think about questions of shading, questions of passive ventilation, passive, as we call them today, sort of passive solar interventions that would allow for the space to be experienced more comfortably. We see in particular, it's a little tiny here, but this image, the drawing in the top left there, I guess I can maybe get it with my mouse, where you see a very simple innovation, if you will, that he plays out in some designs for schools in Puerto Rico, in which he's drawing air, a very simple sort of induced ventilation system, right, just to keep air moving, right? And it's just one of many possible examples. But I focus on Neutra not knowing that Schumacher was going to be, E.F. Schumacher was going to be in the introductory slides, but both Schumacher and Neutra were under the sort of mentorship in this period of a fellow named Leopold Kohr, who was a bit of a strange duck, an Austrian economist living in Puerto Rico, who organized this, proposed what he referred to as skyscraper economies, right? This kind of question of constantly growing up and up, and was really focused around these questions of growth and degrowth in the issue of velocity, right? That from Kohr's perspective, the challenge, the real sort of challenge of environmental harm, we could think of it today relative to carbon emissions, was not only relative to more stuff, right? Kind of more and more and more, as Jean-Baptiste Fresso's fabulous History of Energy that was just published puts it, but how fast that system is churning is really where the environmental damage happens, right? And so part of what we recognize is that in turning on an air conditioner, in opening that sealed door and sort of pushing ourselves in as the wind tries to pull us back, we're participating in that churn. So I want to think about, again, the direct and indirect costs of this cooling system. And I hope you're all sort of with me. We're talking about, again, keeping yourself in this sealed space, keeping yourself in this kind of claustrophobic world of universal comfort, right? Where it's kind of assumed that all of us as we walk into an airport or a retail store and feel the kind of rush of cold air, that we're supposed to be comfortable there, right? And it will always be the same, whether it's June or December, whether it's 3 in the morning or 3 in the afternoon, right? Those spaces are meant to be optimized. The costs are certainly direct, as I was noting, in terms of the waste heat, in terms of the off-gassing, but also indirect in the sort of basic premise of the climate crisis, where we see in this case a sort of geographic indirect impact, and invoking here the sort of triumvirate of the IPCC's approach to addressing climate change, of adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage, right? Sort of who are the vulnerable and who is paying the price. This is a very rough estimation. But also to think about that sort of geographically deferred or indirect, right? But also to think of it in another slide from the IPCC, one that I assume many of you have seen before. It's kind of made the rounds. Temporally indirect, right? The actions that we play out today have an impact on people in the future. And of course, this chart is just sort of showing, based on how much carbon we burn today, sort of how bad is it going to get, how quickly, right? And I mean, it's an academic question in a sense, right? I mean, it's kind of bad enough. It's not to say that, if it gets really bad, then we'll act, right? Maybe, but then again, maybe it is, since it's taken us, we seem to lack the kind of political motivation that would adjust this slide in any substantive way. So I'm still having some issues here, sorry, but we'll get there. Just kind of to go through a few other aspects connecting this kind of obsession with thermal cooling, with air conditioning, with mechanical conditioning, directly to this question of growth. Air conditioning units are one of the most effective distributors of carbon, right? By which I mean they draw carbon out of the ground, use them to produce coolth, right? To kind of condition our spaces and then emit that carbon into the air. I like this relative back to my question of sort of how buildings dream. This slide, which indicates that most homes in hot countries have not yet purchased their first air conditioning, as if the building itself, right, hasn't taken care of it. It doesn't say households Doesn't say heads of household or individuals. The houses themselves, the homes themselves have not yet acquired the capacity to condition themselves. Cooling, as noted, is the fastest growing use of energy in buildings. I'm going to sort of just run through these. We're all accustomed, there's this kind of language of climate slides now, where kind of everything's going up, right? And we sort of can parse through some of the specifics, right? Here we are, 2025. This is the number of air conditioning units estimated to be existing in the European Union, right? We can kind of get obsessed with some of these specifics, but in any event, all of the angle is always upwards, right? And I'll pause for a second on this one. These are all from the International Energy Agency, by the way. They do a biannual report of energy future. This is, again, looking at energy consumption relative to cooling use in particular, space cooling, as you see. And that little pink band on top, right, of behavioral change is one that I want us to kind of keep in our minds, right? And back to our kind of neoliberal premise, we'll get to that in a minute. A kind of sense of how this, not only how efficiencies, as Carles was saying, the sort of terrors of efficiency, but also how the kind of ways that we operate, again, our thermal practices have a role to play. So I'm going to talk through a couple of different projects, projects I've been involved in that are, in effect, trying to think through some of these questions of thermal conditioning, trying to understand how we interact with it, the assumptions that we all make. And it really is that kind of thin pink band, right? It's about that behavioral question, right? And how it relates to the broader structures of architecture and policy, global and otherwise, that impact the way that we operate as individuals in thermal space. And so I'm going to start with this project, again, that Carles mentioned. Terms and Conditions, which is an installation that we made with a number of collaborators. You can see most of them listed here. An installation that we made at the Venice Biennale that is still open, I think, until Monday. So, jet on over and after your degrowth conference, jump on a plane and head to Venice to see a bunch of air conditioners, right? And I don't want to assume, I'm sure maybe a handful of you were there or have been there before. The project was right at the beginning of the Arsenale, right, of this huge building that used to be used to wind up ropes, right, so needed that kind of long length. You can see us number one here at the start, and then the sort of onslaught proceeds. And I'm not here to offer a direct sort of critical analysis of the Biennale, but we can indicate that it was largely filled up with architects exploring means by which technology can provide solutions, right? And so and forgive me if I'm, overstating or there were, of course, a lot of wonderful projects that we're doing under other things, but we really saw ourselves as the kind of gateway, right? You had to go through our room in order to get into this space. So we called it Terms and Conditions with this sense that you sort of had to kind of click the button, right? You had to kind of accept the terms and conditions, as you'll see, of this sort of overheated space in order to kind of move forward into the rest of the exhibition. Oh, thank you. See, I have to stay comfortable. Just another view of the Arsenale, right? Just to kind of give it another sort of visual spin, and then here a slight close-up. So let's take a look at this video. So you're walking in, right? It's the first room. There is sound, but we don't need it because you can imagine, you've already imagined those sealed spaces. Maybe you listen to the hum of the air conditioner, right? We'll be imagining that ourselves in a moment. But you walk in past the kind of introductory work. About a month into the show, they installed this sign, which I think was a good sign to install if anybody had any concerns about entering this space. And then you pass through the thick black PVC curtains, recycled, I should note, and enter into a space with a set of pools that are roughly the height of anticipated flood level in Venice in 2080. And then, as you see, a number of air conditioners hanging from above. And again, you can sort of imagine the hum, quite deafening, right? And some of you who were there, it smelled funny, I think, because of the plastic in the pools. Again, the sound and the drip of the air conditioners was quite overwhelming, and it was hot and uncomfortable, right? It was a very uncomfortable space. And part of that discomfort, and feel free to tell me if your experience was different. But part of that discomfort was that you're looking at these air conditioners and you're anticipating being cold, right? I mean, you don't tend to see an air conditioner and expect to receive the waste heat. But in fact, that is how we had set it up. These are all organized in terms of the kind of split system that we're all quite familiar with. This is the waste heat side, right? So you're walking into, and as you go towards the back, there's more of them on. Admittedly, we put in a few radiant panels because the air conditioners, of course, are quite energy intensive. So, we make some compromises. But it gets more and more hot as you get to the back. And, oh, well, there you were seeing me. There I am, right? You see yourself reflected in this rear mirror and kind of have a moment of understanding that, this is part of what we do every day, right? I mean, and I don't want to speak to anybody here, but part of the practice of air conditioning is its kind of tacit aspect, right? You kind of just turn the knob when you get hot, and you don't kind of necessarily consider adjusting the shades or managing the windows or going out and finding an architect to design you a shading system. Of course, when you get through to the back, push through the back curtain, oops. And when you push through the back curtain, as you saw a second ago, and you'll see again in approximately a minute and a half, you push through the back curtain and then you're experiencing the cool side, right? So you're sort of reversing, the kind of inside is outside. You're reversing the condition. So again, part of what we're trying to organize through the project is a recognition of that reversal, right? I mean, of that direct impact as you experience these spaces. As you are being cooled, someone else is being heated, right? And that's very straightforward. And whether it's a person sitting outside, in various economies, that's a lot of people sitting outside, or whether that's a person, again, temporarily removed from you and sort of into the future, or in another part of the world who is experiencing the impacts of climate change. Every kind of turn of that dial has quite dramatic and difficult effects on some people's lives. And this sort of vicious cycle, right, of kind of cooling systems turning away and heating things up, in many ways has just become a sort of background hum, right? And it's part of this question, I think, around degrowth is how do we get access to some of these systems that are continually, accelerating and growing our carbon use, and how do we sort of, surface those aspects that have been hidden, which of course is very much part of the project here. The anteroom, in effect, attempting to bring the outside side inside, right, to sort of give one that experience of the waste heat, the heat being displaced, as it is in other terms less phenomenally from there to here, right, inside to outside, to the extent that the passage becomes a sort of spatial allegory for those global inequities that I showed through that one slide of vulnerability, right? You're sort of walking through the distinction between those, frankly, who can afford to travel to Venice and see architecture exhibitions, and those who sit on the outside or perform the labor or feel the costs of those impacts. And we were quite gratified, there's the cooling system, quite gratified that a number of the reviews identified that relatively directly in terms of understanding. Jonathan Hall in Wallpaper, wrote that he felt a little uncomfortable having not only in the kind of thermally and physiologically, but Jonathan Bell having kind of, as he put it, you navigate through this, and I'm quoting, you navigate through this and you're confronted with your own reflection, as I just showed you. The person who just flew into this sinking, crumbling, and waterlogged city right on the front lines of the fight between architecture and climate. Now, I don't know that Venice is the front lines, and I don't know that it's a fight, right? But I think we were trying to kind of surface some of these challenges. Okay. So, now I'm gonna shift gears a little bit and give us a little background to some of these questions, right? And another project that I've been involved in also mentioned writing the history of decarbonization efforts, which is to say a sort of bigger question around methodology in the field of architecture history, how we see the past as having utility for the present, right? Some aspects of the past, I mean, again, not so much the Seagram's Tower, not the buildings I'm not showing, but some of the ones that I am showing. Trying to understand how these sort of past practices, and I'm sort of staying still in the 20th century in the sort of modern movement, so to speak, relative to architecture, but how we begin to understand these histories as having direct relevance to our challenges in the present, right? And just so you know, that's very distinct from a lot of sort of mechanisms, means of talking through architectural historical method, which tends to distance from any sort of operational impact, right? I mean, the history sort of speaks on its own terms. It's always historicized. It's in its own context. So there's a sort of a threat or a intervention here that says part of what history can do is help us reimagine, collaborate with these buildings, kind of re-understand our relationship to the present and the future. At more or less the same time that some of these sealed buildings started to emerge, right? Again, the first sealed, fully air-conditioned tower was the Equitable Insurance Tower in Portland, Oregon, designed by Pietro Beluschi, an Italian immigrant. We could get into how appropriate it was that an insurance building was the first site of an air-conditioned space, right? In terms of just sort of hedging and keeping things consistent, right? Kind of taking care of all the risks. But at more or less the same time, buildings such as this were going up in places such as Rio de Janeiro. Of course, a very different economic environment than that of the North in this period. Brazil in this moment sort of trying to enter itself into the global stage on economic terms. And, you know, we all know probably the Ministry of Education and Health, we'll see it briefly in a second, a number of projects in the period in Brazil that were aiming to sort of enter themselves into this realm. But I'm really interested in this image, I mean, that I've assembled, right? But in the sort of components here, you know, you have a relatively straightforward facade. If you've been to Copacabana, this was one of the first high-rise buildings. Of course, now it's all covered in glass towers and hotels and so on. But this in 1945, this was one of the earliest interventions at that scale. You can kind of barely notice that just to the right of this building, there's another one under construction. I don't know if you can tell from those balconies. So a very simple building in a way. It was a building built for the family, the three Roberto brothers and their mother that occupied it and rented out some spaces. Which is indeed in part to say that a lot of the operation I'm about to go through was likely done by domestic help rather than by the owners themselves, and that's not something to ignore. But nonetheless, you see the section that they wrote, that they drew for this project, that helps us to understand a sort of choreography, right? A set again of thermal practices, right? That's not turning a dial or even just kind of simply sealing or unsealing a window, but that's a more complex kind of script that one plays out during the day. And you might open the sash at the bottom in the morning to let a little cool air in, right, with your coffee. This is where you're sitting, right in front of the window. You have the sun at noon is always blocked with fixed vanes for obvious reasons, right? Noon and during the solstice. Adjustable blinds, and you can drop that sunscreen down at 6 p.m. so you can enjoy your caipirinha in comfortable peace, et cetera, right? So a very different sort of approach to how we sort of occupy and experience buildings. It's much more active. Again, a point that I won't make too strongly today, but I think this passive-active allocation relative to solar energy is quite misleading, right? Indeed, what we're looking at here is a very active engagement with the building, right? A very active engagement with its thermal context and how it can change and transform over the day and over the season. And I'll just step through a few more of these by the Roberto brothers and some of their colleagues, all are more or less the same time. And I'm interested not only in the buildings themselves and their function, but also as we're seeing here and as we saw in that previous slide with the section titled in English, right? I mean, for dissemination around the world, right? It wasn't sort of an internal document. And here we see two of the brothers, right, demonstrating this very simple gesture of opening and closing this shading screen. A few others that get more complex. This is one of my favorites where there's just kind of two horizontal and vertical sets of wooden slats, right? And you can sort of cross-hatch them and open them up in different ways to increase the shading intensity. Oscar Niemeyer's famous Obra de Berço, may be known by some of you, sort of in the canon, shall we say. One of the first of these, this was of course quite early, and we'll cycle back to it sort of in a second, but a home for new pregnant and new mothers. And part of the idea was that each different level could be sort of solarly controlled differently, right, by adjusting those screens in different ways. So I'm trying just to kind of give a sense of some of these stories, very quickly, just as an indication of these broader histories, right? And not only, I'm sure many of you know some of these histories, maybe this one or parts of it, but maybe there's other stories that you can tell, or maybe there's experience that you had growing up in a seaside home or in a mountain retreat or in your own home that might have been of many different aspects. How you experience that space thermally, right? And when I teach this course on thermal practices, I get a lot of discussions of people's grandmothers or grandfathers telling them how they used to live in the family home, how they would stay in one room in the winter and another room in the summer, right? These kind of tacit practices that emerge to help us kind of rethink thermal occupation. I'm going to look really quickly at this project by Le Corbusier, again, just trying to give us some kind of coordinates, right? Some kind of signposts to walk through. Projected for, indeed, a region outside of Barcelona as part of the Gatapac project that I expect many of you are familiar with. Never built, but intended to provide, as you see in the model that was built long after the fact for an exhibition, a sort of simple form of row housing, right? And what look to be garages at the bottom are actually sort of social spaces, right? Are actually a version of the jardin suspendu that would emerge in the unité d'habitation and other buildings, a sort of indoor-outdoor space for sociality, right? And we'll see that play out in a second. But we see, the sort of basics of the section, an open space down below. It's a bit difficult because we're also seeing all the plumbing, but open ventilation spaces that allow for air to come up through this flue. And we also see this kind of very straightforward, very simple graphic indication of solar variability, right? You can move this shading system that you can see, again, briefly, you can see in small form in the model. You can move this shading system in a number of different sort of resting spots, right? To adjust the thermal interior, to some extent, at least the light, according to your seasonal or daily needs. I've been a little obsessed. Well, sorry, let me jump to this before I get obsessed. This is just to show briefly those interiors, right? Those kind of indoor-outdoor spaces that we're intending to open this out in a communal fashion. And Le Corbusier was also really focused on each house having a tree, right? So there was a kind of broader, I'm not trying to ascribe ecological knowledge to Le Corbusier in the 30s of relevance to today, but nonetheless an important point. So I've been a bit obsessed with this section on these terms, right? And which is to say that on the one hand, we see a relatively well-designed building. We could get into the whole history of Le Corbusier's misconception of climate angles and mishaps and kind of, at various buildings in Paris and Moscow and Geneva. I won't bother us with that today, but what I'm really interested in here, this is the same section, of course, and forgive me, I'm assuming most of you are architecturally inclined and know that we're looking at the kind of cut through the cake when I talk about a section. You can see the kind of blue arrow, well, not quite arrows, the blue lines, right? Not arrows yet, arrows would come soon, that are showing a certain amount of ventilation through up through that staircase. It's kind of acting as a chimney. The green roof, which was not on most of the other drawings as well, but especially I'm interested in this fellow here, right? And this sort of, I think it's, I've gone back and forth between beekeeper and butterfly catcher. I've kind of landed on butterfly catcher, but one can imagine many things. But part of the idea is to recognize that this kind of life that was imagined in the modern period, right, was not simply a life of kind of efficiency and establishing materials and systems that would allow for this kind of universal condition to play out. It was that, right? And it was Le Corbusier who said that all buildings should be 18 degrees all the time. Of course, now they're more like 24, but leave that for now. But what sort of world could be imagined, right? What sort of practices could we play out? What sort of lifestyle, l'esprit nouveau, et cetera, what sort of life could we lead in this newly imagined space? So this sort of idea, I think in many ways, more than some of the techniques, had a pretty profound impact on a lot of the buildings of the period. We can see even embedded within very neoliberal and aggressive approaches to expanding the US Embassy project around the world, a lot of these shading systems, shading techniques, mechanisms of designing the facade to sort of reimagine the experience of the interior played out. This is one of my favorites, a very well shaded building in Washington, D.C., initially designed for the American Association of the Advancement of Science, the organization that publishes the journal Science, but more recently part of the Embassy of Tunisia. And some that we might know a little better than others, right? Certes Peabody Housing Project in Cambridge with the kind of range of different shading systems throughout the various facades. The British Petroleum House in Nigeria, another interesting story. British Petroleum entering into Nigeria at the very end of its colonial period. And in fact, it's just one of these things that happens in history. On October 1st, 1960, the day that this building was kind of feted and opened, and Jane Drew was there. She had a horrible cold, and she writes in her diary about how clouded her head was, but how beautiful it was to see the light shining off of the louvers. It's the same day that Nigeria established its political independence from Great Britain, right, from the UK. So this sort of moment of a kind of pushback against direct colonization and a sort of welcoming in of the kind of neo-colonization of oil powers and other sorts of economic systems reliant on perpetuating growth. I'm giving a very sort of snapshot version of some of these stories, but the idea is really just to help us understand that there's a whole wealth of history in the field of architecture. And I've shown one kind of more or less local here, at least a project. One could find others around the world that help us to reimagine the sort of terms and conditions again, right, that we respond to, that we sort of aspire to as we engage with and adjust our buildings. And so we're looking briefly at the figures of Victor and Aladar Ogyay, Hungarian architects who emigrated to the US and entered into a sort of shared faculty role at Princeton. Most of the stories about the sort of assessment reviews of them are they were constantly fighting in front of the students. They were fraternal twins and apparently really didn't get along. Didn't speak very good English, right? But they were very good at modeling, right? And thinking about, in a way, this object we see here, which they called the thermoheliodon, was a kind of analog version of what emerged immediately after, which were computational versions of performance modeling, right? And so they not only have the sun, as you would normally have in a sun analysis, a heliodon, but they also have this plastic dome to, in effect, mimic, right, the thermal conditions in the interior. Totally didn't work, right? It was they got money from the NSF. When they applied for additional funds, the NSF was like, but your system does not function. Why would we fund you? And the problem they had was that a brick, if you imagine a kind of tiny brick that's built up relative to that model, performs very differently thermally than a real brick, right, than a full-scale brick. So that they spent a lot of their time doing calculations that would adjust those assessments. And of course, now this is all done on the computer in 2 seconds, right? But in 1957, such things were not yet possible. So they mostly did drawings such as this, right, and sort of these elaborate, opaque sort of user's guides to kind of thinking about how to design with climate. As opaque and confounding as this might be, it was more or less the basis for Ecotect, which was, did anybody use Ecotect back in the day? One of the first performance softwares? No, not a lot of fans. Designed by Andrew Marsh in 1989 in Western Australia. So there's a direct continuity between some of these experiments from the 40s and 50s, understanding shading systems and their behaviors into the present. Another direct connection is just this sort of basic premise around the comfort zone. And I'm assuming, again, some of you work with psychometric charts or have seen them, right? I really like this image on the right, which is kind of an early version of a psychometric chart, which is to say an understanding of how heat and humidity affect the human body and how to best sort of optimize those thermal spaces. This is not a scientific drawing, right? Or it sort of is. It's quasi-technical, right? It's both data and desire, right? It's both a kind of set of information, above it says on the far right, it says sultry, right? Once it's sort of above a certain temperature and humidity. There's another unbearable above this line is that dashed line on top, right? So it's really indicating a set of more or less factual information, right? Don't go there, yeah? But also doing so with this kind of framing of desire. And of course, we see Aladar, we can tell it's Aladar. He was always the one with the pipe, lounging on a chaise, reading a newspaper, the kind of ideal 50s man in the gray flannel suit, right? And it was a man, and it was a white man in a suit. And of course, that's also, sort of what happens in this story is that this idea that was initially articulated architecturally, right? There were architectural means to produce this condition of comfort was just sort of extracted by ASHRAE, by the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, to articulate the comfort zone. And the comfort zone then became a system that was modulated and has been adjusted over time over the past couple of decades as the sort of, again, the optimal space of thermal conditioning, right? Where we have no practice, where we have no thermal practice, we simply rest at leisure. And of course, some of you may know these stories, but the initial discussions of ASHRAE were articulated through a series of tests by the Carrier Air Conditioning Company in 1914, performed on undergraduate students at Yale, all white boys with their shirts off, sitting in rooms. How do you feel? How do you feel now? How do you feel now, right? That is the sort of foundational basis of the comfort zone. So Aladar's suit and a pipe and the chaise, he's kind of still playing out that model. Okay, I'm gonna jump again to another project to start to close things up. a project that I did in collaboration with some colleagues in the Netherlands, Nick Axel in particular, one of the editors at eFlux, and sort of help us again to think through this question of practices, right? But help us again, and part of what I think has framed a lot of what I was just going through, help us to recognize another kind of neoliberal aspect of this, which is the extent to which David Harvey refers to neoliberalism as a process of accumulation by dispossession, right? So that is, and this is sort of back to the Neutra quote, right? That as we gather health and safety and sort of thermal comfort, right, as we sort of accumulate these capacities to self-realize and make money and sort of optimize our own lives, someone else is experiencing dispossession. So during the International Architecture Biennale Rotterdam in 2023, we were invited to do an intervention to think through questions of comfort. In this iteration, it was being held at the Het Nooy Institute in Rotterdam, which we're picturing here. You can see these two volumes. The brick volume in front of us is the exhibition space, usually quite cold. And the glass sort of mini office tower behind, three-story office tower, is the library and parts of the archive and the director's space. And then behind it is this large bar that is the archive of the National Architecture Archive of the Netherlands, right? So a valuable, treasured space for architects and others. Here's a very quick early sketch just to give you a sense of those coordinations. Now, the reason I play this out is that our ambition initially, when we started having discussions with the IIBR, was to ask them to turn off their air conditioner when it got too hot, right? So if the temperature reached, we initially said 32, then we pushed it to 35. If it got too hot outside in Rotterdam does experience heat waves in the summer, that they would stop trying, right, to counteract that heat with mechanical cooling, and instead would turn it off, close the exhibition hall, and then when it got cooler, when it went down back below 32, they would open the space up again, right? And we frame this as kind of like you get to party at midnight in the museum because that's when it's going to be cool enough to walk around. For a number of you can probably guess some of the reasons that was rejected as an idea, right? The main one, again, being insurance, not only in terms of the archive, which we'll get to in a second, but even more generally, just kind of the insurance of objects, the other objects on display. I'm just showing you some images of the building. So that idea was rejected out of hand, and initially we thought we might just display the 300 emails that were involved in trying to push it forward, but decided that was a bit too cynical, and discovered in the process that the Nooy Institute was in the process of replacing their HVAC system, right, of bringing in a new mechanical system. And it, it's a really interesting institution. I don't know if many of you know it. I mean, in many ways, quite similar to some of our valued institutions here, present today, really trying to do the right thing, right? I mean, really thoughtful about their thermal practices, thoughtful about their institutional relationships. They have formed something that they call a ZOOP, which is a zoological cooperative, which is basically, I think we saw briefly, there are a number of ponds on the site, right, with fish in them, and there's a representative of those ponds in the board meetings. I mean, it's a little more nuanced than that, but that's the basic idea, right? Nature is represented. So in terms of trying to do the right thing, we wanted to understand how they were trying to sort of best transform their thermal environment by virtue of this intervention of a new system, right? And part of what we discovered is that, in many ways they were quite frustrated. Their options were limited. The kind of contractors they had access to, of course, the resources were limited. They're ending up on the decision to sort of get the most efficient HVAC installation, right, was in a way sort of the best option they could make. And so what we did is went through and had interviews with a number of the primary actors within the space. We've been talking with the operations manager here to understand how they had the opportunity to transform their thermal practices at the same time that some of these other spaces, oh wait, this isn't going forward, there we go. To understand that they had the opportunity to sort of reimagine their own thermal practices as, taking this moment of the transformation of the new mechanical system. I'm almost done. To begin to transform their own tacit practices, right? So we were just looking at the operations manager. One of the things that she noted was that in the hot summer, when that little office tower I showed you a moment ago gets way too hot, the director comes and hangs out in the basement in the operations staff break room, because that's the coolest space in the building. And so he said, that's when we get all the work done, right? That's when they sort of put all the budgets in front of them and sort of try to manage those things. A much more challenging space is the archive. We talked with the archivist at great length, and Mel Ahern, an art historian based at the University of British Columbia, simultaneously published an essay and a series I'll get to at the end, talking about how changing the set points in some of these institutional systems, right, can still keep these papers and drawings and objects quite safe, by which I mean instead of being, say 18 degrees and 20% humidity, it could be 23 degrees and 50% humidity, as long as it stays consistent, right, in some cases. So it's in part just to reflect that there's a lot of analysis and understanding of how we treat our valued spaces thermally that are opening up some opportunities. 5 minutes. Okay, I thought I didn't even have that much left. Okay. And part of what's happening here as well is just a real sense of understanding what those thermal practices are, right? And I return to this question of thermal practices and want to sort of elaborate it on a couple of scales. Insofar as, the ways that we operate within buildings, right? What we do, I mean, I took off my jacket, that could be a thermal practice, right? Or sort of how we clothe and engage ourselves, what we expect from others on those terms. Here we're seeing this at more the kind of institutional setting, but we also can think about this framing of thermal practices relative to what architects do, right? That if our practices as designers come to be seen as having an impact, again, writing a script in some of the examples that I've shown, having a sort of relationship to the thermal practices of the inhabitant. And also to think about it, let's say at the policy level, right? That some of our sort of political activity, whether that be electoral or in the streets or other ways that we're expressing or in writing policy papers or engaging with policymakers, to think about this question of the thermal interior as a sort of primary object of refinement on these terms. So on the one hand, that question of thermal practices, I hope offers, or at least it's intended to kind of be thought through as a little bit of hopefulness, right? In the sense of a kind of capacity to imagine other ways of practicing, right? Other ways of inhabiting. This is a series that I've been co-editing for a couple of years now. We're about to relaunch in January, called After Comfort, a User's Guide.
Perdón.
That's okay. Give some time to see the video. Okay, yeah, good. Okay. Let me do it again. So this is a series that, again, was going on for about 2 years and then went on break, and we'll relaunch it in January. 30 articles from architects, artists, poets, scholars, building inhabitants, right? Sort of normal people, geographers, et cetera, thinking through this question of life inside after fossil fuels, right? What are the strategies and tactics? I mean, some of them are kind of horror stories, right? But the moist one in particular. But most of them are sort of strategies, ways of thinking about operating a bit differently in our interiors. One of my favorites, I think we'll see it if I do it again, right at the top. Oh no, I'm sorry, it's way at the bottom. It was the first one, by Alexandra Kedziorek, also the curator of the fabulous Polish Pavilion in Venice, when you go visit this weekend. Alexandra wrote an essay about clothing the home, right? Sort of hanging from the context of northern Poland, hanging textiles at various parts of the year to sort of increase the insulation in a very sort of casual, practical fashion. So again, there's about 30 essays on here that share a number of different ideas, and about 20 more will come starting in January. But I think another sort of challenge of this, and this is in effect where I'll be concluding, another challenge that this suggests is another aspect of this kind of neoliberal framing that I've tried to use here. If on the one hand, we can be thoughtful about, that sort of question of neoliberalism as sort of informing the performance of these interior spaces, right, that have no care for their impact on the rest of the world around them, when in fact that impact is quite extreme. When we can also think about this question of neoliberalism relative to the issue of accumulation by dispossession, right, that, again, and back to our Neutra sort of black and white system, right? That as I am comfortable, someone else is not, right? And at least on mechanical terms, right? Keeping those things in mind. But the problem that I face, and in the user's guide that I just sort of quickly showed through, and I hope you have some time to take a look at it. This other neoliberal trope, which is that it's kind of all up to us, right? That we kind of not only critically do we criticize Thatcher for saying that there's no society, but we also recognize that a lot of our behavior as architects is trying to find solutions because nobody else is doing anything about it, right? And a lot of our behavior as individuals, whether that's through recycling or taking the bus or your Lime bikes or whatever the case may be, is negotiating this question of a sort of collapse of real political will and assuming it's a sort of lifestyle choice, right? And so I want to just kind of elevate that as one of the challenges that we face. Optimistically, again, insofar as the World Sufficiency Lab, as Yamina Saheb writes in this stream, maybe not, there we go, that we've now already seen a few times, but we'll try to do it again, maybe. Maybe not. Well, she talks about how sufficiency is aiming to bring planetary well-being at the intersection of daily practices and policy proposals, right? And these are the kind of frameworks that she's trying to introduce as the topics for sufficient engagement, right? Reducing efficiency, focusing on the reduction of demand rather than the efficient use of what's being used, right? In between social practice and policy proposals. And I just want to end with a suggestion that that's kind of where architects sit, right? Is somewhere in between the kind of daily practices of users, inhabitants of all sorts, right, according to different programs, and the regulations and policy and mechanisms, and to some couple levels of remove the governance and the global governance aspects that help us reimagine these spaces with larger consequences. So a sort of charge, I hope, to action. I mean, not that I'm assuming if you're here, you're already kind of out there doing the good work, but a recognition that we occupy a really important space in this field, right, of sort of translating these potential policy transformations to the experience of the public, and similarly drawing out the consequences and the opportunities and thermal practices of individuals and collectives up to a set of policy consequences. Thank you for your time.
Mm-hmm.
Even here, because then we don't know what's happening next, right?
So thank you, Daniel. Just wanted to mention that this intervention that you tried to do at the Het Nieuw Institute, somebody managed to do it here last year. Joanna Moy, an artist, did the same proposal to Santa Monica, an art space, and they did close when the moments that they surpassed the carbon budget with all the consumption of the building, and this caused, they convinced the manager, but they caused a lot of trouble because there was other artists in the exhibition, and the other artists, they were very angry that people could not see their piece of art because we run out of carbon budget. Obviously, this I think this helped to create this debate that I think is one of the things that you bring, no? That we need to focus more on the use also of the buildings.
But I think also to kind of, I appreciate that, and it's great to hear that that's going on, but also to focus a bit on the anger, right? I mean, the sort of emotional challenges that we're facing as we shift our aspirations, right? I mean, again, I'm not a psychologist or anything of that nature, but thinking about how buildings can sort of be different things, if we're really going to sort of move past this reliance on universal comfort, we're going to have different expectations of ourselves, right? We're going to maybe work less. We're going to sort of perform differently in different contexts, right? I mean, it's opening up a new world where that universal system of kind of always optimized is less important than whatever else you decide.
We have time for one or two questions. Maybe I can collect a couple of short questions if you have somebody in the room. Maybe. No, para traducción. Es para la...
You can understand this.
Es para traducción.
Okay, let's do. Okay. in English. The graph that you showed at the beginning, where you said fix, there's the behavioral component. There were a lot of, this one. So behavioral change, that's the pink line.
It's just...
So, and then you say to us, okay, let's fix on this phenomenon of behavioral change, and then you talk 25 minutes on behavioral change. So what I understand from this graph is that what we can change on the consumption by behavioral change is like 4% of all consumption.
So this is drawn by the International Energy Agency.
Yeah.
Right. Their investment is in the efficiency of air conditioners. Right. The position of the International Energy Agency is that there will be many more air conditioners, millions more, 1,400% increase, 1400 increase in air conditioning use by 2100. Right. That is their project. Yeah. So they're drawing this map to indicate because that perpetuates the system that the sort of business as usual as the climate discussion tends to term that framework, right? So this is not, what I'm suggesting is that, the pink should be larger.
Yeah. Okay. We are on that one. And now Alex wants to say something, so let him.
Okay, so thank you so much for this, I would say, provocative talk. For me, it's provocative, at least. So I'll be very short. First of all, for me, the question is, how relevant is actually 20th century modern architecture movement we are talking all the time about for the 21st century challenges? Because in my opinion, it's not relevant, almost at all. Sorry for saying that,
that's fine,
I think. Yeah. And the second one, do you think that behavioral change should be done by the users and occupants or by the architects in the first place, or designers? Let's say designers. I mean, we engineers are also designers.
Yeah, I'll take the second one first because it's easier. Both, right? And I think part of this question of thermal practices is quite precisely, how. Well, the term in the thermal comfort discourse is adaptive opportunities, right? How can you design a condition whereby an individual can find it beguiling, pleasing, pleasurable, desired to take advantage of an opportunity that is less carbon hungry, right? And that could be, again, in the slide that I was trying to show with the sort of tree, the plants in front of the window, that can be something very simple in terms of a nice place to sit in a place that warms in the winter, right? But that can also be in terms of interfaces and mechanisms that allow for the shading control system to operate according to a more intuitive fashion, right? Other sorts of, again, user interface and significantly more complicated interventions. But to think about it in terms of, part of the designer's job is to give the user the opportunity to transform their thermal practices, right? And to think about it as a practice. I mean, you practice guitar so that you can get that song better, right? You practice yoga so you can hold the pose, etc. You don't practice smoking. It's a habit. It's a bad thing. It's like an impulse, right? It's not something you want to do. But a practice is aspiration, right? So I think part of what I'm trying to map out is that the aspiration of the designer and the user should be to find a way to collaborate together on reducing energy throughput, right? And in many different ways, but in particular through space cooling, through less use of mechanized space cooling. Right? So the architect is necessary, but I don't think we should treat users as sort of, half asleep subjects, right? But often as people who can be activated and engaged in this process, program specific, and of course there's many caveats, but that's the sort of general idea. Very quickly, relative to the modern architecture question, yeah, sure. I mean, I think on the one hand, concrete, steel, and glass, total nightmare, right? And we're still struggling with it. I mean, our buildings are not fit to purpose. And I love Alan Weisman's book, The World Without Us, that came out about 2007, where he sort of imagines that if suddenly humans disappear, kind of Thanos, effect, if suddenly humans disappear from the Earth, what will happen to the natural system? And the first, I can't remember if it's 30 years or 300 years, but it's just mold everywhere, right? As these interior spaces stop being so heavily conditioned, the fungus increase, right? So we're conditioning our buildings, we're conditioning ourselves, right? And we're doing it through a system that's no longer working. The modern architecture that I showed here, the sort of interwar and immediate post-war work that's experimenting in a period just before oil was really efficiently economically available, right? So it's one of a set of examples, and I have another book on solar houses, and I have PhDs working on all sorts of so-called vernacular practices or sort of pre-modern practices. Part of the issue is that one of modern architecture's innovations, right, was to radically delegitimize customary practice. Anything that came before, no longer of interest. We are progress. We are steel. We are glass. We are concrete. And that was in a kind of scar that we're still kind of putting aloe on, I think, a bit as a field. Again, in many different contexts, these sorts of customary practices have, and I call them customary because they persisted, right? They're not in the past. They've happened in different forms in different places. But I think part of our ambition broadly is to return to and imagine those practices that can support us in the decarbonization effort, right? And whether that was Korb in the 1930s or some random Hungarian emigre in the 1950s or a communal village practice in the 1400s, right? I think we want to think about history as a sort of database of carbon strategies or reduced carbon strategies, right? And approach it from that perspective. So from that perspective, a lot of modern architecture will not be of interest to us, right? But little bits and pieces. I'm not trying to save modern architecture. That's not the project here.
Thanks.
Gracias. I also think maybe today you keep it very fast, but you also show examples of how this modern architecture has been dismantled and went to AC and all these things. We just saw unlearning what was maybe the things that were well designed on those projects. Maybe others from nowadays perspective we can be more critic, but there's some that could be interesting.
I would just say that I think part of what I'm trying to play out here is to bring into our sort of framework of sort of what happened with modern architecture, right? It brought this kind of within our field, kind of way of thinking, a way of designing, a way of relating to materials and systems and process, brought along with it this kind of stream of materials, right? And air conditioning and the kind of need to, the sort of correlation between those materials, again, steel, glass, and concrete, and the need to be constantly conditioning those spaces. That's a big part of the sort of material flow, right, that modern architecture initiated, expanded, proselytized, right, sort of sold to governance around the world, right? And so how we sort of take that piece apart is a lot of what I'm interested in.
We need to close here. So thank you, Daniel, for your talk.